Well, hello there, and welcome to week 5. Three of my favorite topics as we move to another level of leadership: transformational, authentic, and servant leadership. This is probably the opposite end of the spectrum from where we started with things like behavioral and situational and path goal, but nevertheless part of the leadership mix to be considered when thinking about leadership. So, transformational leadership, um, as it might portend, is about engaging with others and raising the level of morality in the leader and the followers. So, it's about changing and transforming people versus the type of transactional leadership we've been studying, which focuses more on the exchanges between leaders and followers, either from the follower's perspective or the leader's perspective. One of the things that your texts point out is be careful of the pseudo transformational leadership, the type of leadership that looks like it's transformational but is really more self consumed, exploitive, power oriented, and may not exactly be morally on track. It might have more to do with the leader's own interests. Uh, Clearly, in the political season we're experiencing, we're seeing a lot of that, whatever side of the aisle you might be in. One of the things that the chapter does emphasize is the role that charisma plays, and there is a chart on actually 8.1 that talks about the types of things: the behaviors, the competence, the articulate, the high expectations that these type of leaders engender and cause in followers in their response to those kind of behaviors and characteristics of the leader, with trust, beliefs that they feel are in sync, a kind of acceptance and identification, as well as an emotional connect. Text also references the Nanas and Kouzes models, which we've been studying with the additional chapters I've been giving you, especially the model the way approach that Kouzes emphasizes, and Bennis as well in the shared vision, the ideas of enabling followers. So transformational is something that we see, especially in the human services. It's been widely researched. It's kind of intuitive, process oriented, has a bigger view, broader view, focused on the followers, and there's effective evidence that it does work. I think you could see how it might fit in a social work context as well. The weaknesses are still some conceptual clarity, somewhat measured. It only goes so far, and whether or not it is still highly dependent on personality, might even be anti-democratic and abused, can be abused in some ways by someone who is very charismatic. We certainly have seen that in the nonprofit sector, with whether it's been the scandals in United Way or other nonprofits, religious institutions, when that does happen. And some transformational leadership helps build a vision, relate to the needs of followers, and change organizational dynamics. So the vision thing, real focus on followers and changing the way organizations work. I want to skip authentic for a minute and come back to that, because that is really my favorite type of leadership. So the next one, servant leadership, is also one of these style type of leaderships, I would call it. And that is a paradox of sorts, because although it's about leadership, this is really highly focused on the followers. So it puts followers first, and especially looks at it from an ethical point of view. And the basics of it are very simple. The good of the followers, developing the followers, strong moral behavior, social responsibility, characteristics, very much like what we learn in the social work profession, listening, empathy, healing, awareness, persuasion in terms of non-judgmental, conceptualization, so on and so forth. There's a table in the chapter, I think it may be 10.1, that certainly shows this in great detail. The model is that there has to be some previous condition, so this doesn't work in every environment. It's about context and culture, depends on the leader's own attributes, and it depends on whether or not followers are receptive to this style. The leader behaviors that one would use would have to do with conceptualizing the organization, emotional healing, followers first, helping followers grow and succeed, behaving ethically, empowering, creating value for the greater community. I think you could see how this might clearly fit in some of our situations, especially working with mission, vision-oriented groups. In some ways, it's almost a little bit like a group strategy. Outcomes are that followers perform and grow, the organizational performance gets better, and societal impact. The strengths are it's very altruistic, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it works where followers are ready for this. Weaknesses are a little bit of a contradiction in the title, because the leader still has to do some stuff. It's kind of a highly dependent on process, a little utopian. Bottom line is a philosophy and a set of behaviors to promote learning and self-development is what it amounts to. Now, authentic leadership, as I mentioned, is my favorite, and this is a theory that has come into the fore, especially since 9/11, as people began to search for a more authentic. A lot of folks point to that event as an event which kind of shaped the foundation of people's beliefs in systems and leaders, and I don't think it's by accident that every institution, government or otherwise, has been challenged since that time for its authenticity. We certainly also have heard a lot about it in the current political environment. Once again, whichever end of the spectrum that you're on, is that the candidates that are really drawing the followings and people coming out represent a certain type of authenticity to the followers. So the important thing about this theory is that it comes from intrapersonal factors. It comes from leaders' own story, where they come from, their conviction. They tend to be originals. They tend to be value-driven. They tend to have a life story. It's one of the other reasons why whenever somebody starts to identify themselves as a leader, they usually write a book about where they came from, who their dad was, who their family was. But that generally connects well when there is an authenticity. I'm sorry, I seem to be getting a buzzing here. It's developmental, it's nurtured, it has to come out of a life genesis. It's about having positive psychology and strong ethics. I mean, these people are generally walk the walk and talk the talk. You don't have to dig deep to know where they come from and who they are. There's buy-in. There's tends to be a practical approach to doing things, developmental, collaborative, as well as purposeful. The societal strengths is that there's a need for this right now. People are clamoring for it. The weakness is, it's somewhat formative. It's new, and you need some type of real organized process, like a path goal approach, to still get to the ends. In summation, authentic leadership is a complex process that emphasizes the development of qualities that help leaders to be perceived as trustworthy, believable, and interested in the common good of serving others. So all of that is wonderful, and I think it's very much needed in this day and age. But as I say, I think you got to combine this with another implementation leadership approach in order to get things done. The other attachments that I have here are summations of some other readings that I gave you, which I think reinforce the idea of leaders looking at the big picture and also looking at the follower needs. Tom Peters, who I use a lot, I especially like his concepts of managing by example and management by walking around versus KITA, which is kick 'em in the ass management. You want a leader that's up front, that is there with those being led. He talks about deferring to the front line, delegating, bashing the bureaucracy. The idea that we were always taught that there was the triangle, and as you got to the top of the organization, you didn't have to do much in terms of supporting others. Peter says turn that triangle upside down, and actually when you're at the top, you're at the bottom, and you've got to support everyone in the organization. Corporate cultures reinforce the idea that organizations are really cultures, those of you that have studied anthropology. And I hope you got to read the article where heroes or heroines personify the values that drive the behaviors that people implement, that strong cultures are rich in complex systems of values, which is why I like the nonprofit sector as opposed to weak cultures where people waste a lot of time figuring out how to do things. These are some of the cultural values that Kennedy and Deal, these were the first guys that wrote about this back in the 90s, identified as what was important. And this is a little chart that I've devised that I use with my staff in introducing this concept for them to talk about different types of things like leadership and services to clients. As how do you see the values and behaviors and who epitomizes what we should be doing now, and how do you see where we should be going? So the way you use this chart is you do it backwards. You actually start with a person in mind. So when you're talking about service and to clients, if it's not something in your current environment, you might look at someone who you encountered or even a family member or someone else who really treats people well and identify what type of behaviors show you that, and then extrapolate into what are the values that support that. So I hope this helps in a way bring together this concept of authenticity, servant, transformational approaches, and how you can implement it in real concrete ways in an organization. This brings to a close the first half of our discussion of these different leadership theories, and I hope that this little presentation gives you some idea of how these particular leadership theories play a role in all